So good evening, everyone, and welcome, and we're so happy that you were able to come and join us for what we hope will be a very stimulating and thought-provoking discussion tonight. My name is Jonathan Anderson. I'm the chair of the Public Administration Department, and I have a tiny role tonight, which is welcoming you, and then turning over the mic to others in our group. I'm going to introduce, first of all, Dr. Tom McQueenie. Dr. McQueenie is currently a full-time lecturer for us, but came from, I won't say how many years in Washington, D.C., working in the highest levels, working both as an employee in Homeland Security and also as a consultant in management, has a lot of contacts and knowledge with the Washington, D.C., the inside the Beltway world. And Tom, I will turn it right over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad you can come tonight. I really am honored to be here. This is my first full-time semester, and it's a very enjoyable experience working with you. So I see so many of you in the audience that I know so well, and thank you for coming. Thank you. I'm going to be very brief as well because you came to see them. I want to give you just a little context of what we're doing here. I'll speak personally. On September 11, 2001, 9/11, I was in what was called the SIOC in the FBI. It's the Operations Command Center, about ready to brief the director of the FBI on the terrorist threat. And as we're getting ready on our strategy, as we're getting ready for that briefing, we see on the monitors the planes hit the building. And we saw, the first time they thought it was an accident, and then within 10 minutes later, you knew it was the real thing. And everybody knew the world had changed. The interesting thing is that the director that we were briefing had been on the job 2 days. He was the second day on the job as head of the FBI, and it was, oh my God, what do I do? But he wasn't alone. There was so many things that were new about that time. If you recall, President Bush was elected as the education president, and he was reading books to kids when that happened. There was no TSA. There was no Department of Homeland Security. There was no rules about anything. This was a new world, and people were struggling hard to figure out how to deal with this new emergency. Among the things that started happening in the emerging conflict was, as happens in all conflicts, casualties, battles, and prisoners of war, prisoners of battles. Typically, there have been rules, and we'll talk about this during the session, of how you deal with prisoners of war. But the new people, and I'm saying because I think that's one of the reasons that we've had the problem that we had, ask themselves the question, how can these be prisoners of war when there's not really a war? We didn't declare a war in any country. When you take a prisoner, you take their name, rank, and serial number. These people didn't have serial numbers, probably didn't have ranks, and so we decided they're not prisoners. There's something called detainees. All the rules about how you deal with prisoners dealt with official prisoners of war. There were no rules about how you deal with people that are called detainees. And so the question for all the new policymakers are, how can we protect the homeland? How can we get the information that we need in a way that's going to protect us, and need we really be bound by the rules that have defined our behavior in the past? Well, the answer was no at that time. And you're going to hear from our guests today why they thought that may have been a wrong answer and probably a harmful answer. And I want to, I'm going to be introducing them in a second, but before I do, I want to just show you a brief video that's going to give you a little bit of background of the issues that were being discussed, the dialogue that was going on. You're going to see some officials. You're going to see a former CIA official. You're going to see a short clip of the vice president. And just its background. It's a little grainy. We had to take the stuff off of YouTube, so bear with us. It's not the highest quality. But I think it'll give you a little background of what the evening is going to be about. Cyrus, could you roll the first video?
Graphic new details of the post-9/11 U.S. torture program came to light Tuesday when the Senate Intelligence Committee released a 500-page summary of its investigation into the CIA. The report concluded the intelligence agency failed to disrupt a single plot despite torturing al-Qaeda and other captives in secret prisons worldwide between 2002 and 2006. Senator Dianne Feinstein, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, outlined the report's key findings.
CIA's management of the program was inadequate and deeply flawed. The CIA program was far more brutal than people were led to believe.
The Senate report details a list of torture methods used on prisoners: waterboarding, sexual threats with broomsticks, medically unnecessary rectal feeding. In one case, a prisoner had his entire lunch tray of hummus, pasta, and nuts pureed and administered by enema. Prisoners were threatened with buzzing power drills. Some captives were deprived of sleep for up to 180 hours, at times with their hands shackled above their heads. According to the Senate report, the CIA ran black sites in Afghanistan and Lithuania, Romania, Poland, Thailand, and a secret site at the Guantanamo Naval Base known as Strawberry Fields.
Is there anything to the Geneva Convention, to the world rule of law on this issue?
Sure there is, but remember the terrorists were not covered by the Geneva Convention. They were unlawful combatants, and under those circumstances, they were not entitled to the normal kinds of courtesies and treatment you would expect.
It's when the water starts to push down and you start to gasp for air. And when you take that gasp, that's when it overrides your epiglottis. It will start pouring into your lungs. And you start feeling it right about here. And that's when you start to panic and you start to struggle. And as you start to struggle, you start pushing on your vitals. And then if you start kicking your feet together, and then you start violently spasming because your body is saying, I am in an emergency situation. I need to get out of this situation. This is imminently life-threatening.
Can I say something about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? He's the one that was responsible for the death of Danny Pearl, the Wall Street reporter. He slit his throat in front of the camera. I don't know what type of man it takes to cut the throat of someone in front of you like that, but I can tell you that this is an individual who probably didn't give a rat's ass about having water poured on his face. For the first time in our history, we had an enemy come into our homeland and kill 3,000 people. I mean, that was a huge deal. People jumping from the towers to their death, the people running away from the cloud of dust, terrified out of their mind. This was a threat, and we had to throw everything at it. We made some Al-Qaeda terrorists with American blood on their hands uncomfortable for a few days, but we did the right thing for the right.
I would like to see.
We, those of you who have taken our PA 315 class know we have a 2-week ethics module. And in that module, we talk about an ethical moment. It's the issue in which we all are going to face at some point in our lives where we come across a decision we have to make, and we have to decide if we're going to make something consistent with our value system, or inconsistent, or look the other way. And we've talked in class about it. You've talked in class about it. The issue here is to understand that the people who thought that torture was wrong, our guests in front, decided that it was their responsibility to carry the torch for dignity and ethics and the right thing. And we also talked about the people that do that have very little reward, put their careers and lives on the line, cause an awful lot of risk to be taken. And the dialogue continues to be, why would people do that? We hope in public administration. The idea of public administration is serving the public, and we hope to inculcate in everybody the notion that there are ethical moments, and sometimes doing the right thing with a high value for our country and for our people require actions like you're going to hear from the people today. I'm going to be introducing them in just a second. I want to make a point. This is it's not a debate. It's not a series of presentations. I'm glad you could come, and please be relaxed. This is a forum. It's the first in what I hope are a variety of forums in which you can hear people discuss their experiences, you can ask questions about them, and hopefully we'll all be a little better off because of this change in dialogue. So we're going to ask you for your questions too. And what we decided to do, rather than have people hesitate to ask questions, we're going to have students, Dr. Baker is pointing out to some students who are going to be sitting around the room with pencils and papers, and we're going to ask you if you have a question at any point during the dialogue to just raise your hand a little bit, and they'll come over and give you a piece of paper. You write the question out there, and we'll read it for you. So just be aware they'll be sitting over here, and look around for the students, and just make a little motion. You can do that, right? Just raise your hand and wiggle it a little bit. You want to practice that at all? Very, very good. And write your question down, and we'll look at it, and we'll read it out loud, okay? All right, then I have the high honor of introducing our guests. I'd like to introduce them one at a time. First of all, Mr. Mark Fallon. Mark was a director, assistant director deputy assistant director of NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Homeland Security, and was named to be a major senior official by the White House in determining the policy and the regulations, the operations of the whole detainee program, and what was to be done and what was not to be done. He's an operational fellow. His experience on the ground is second to almost no one in this field, and we're very fortunate to have him here. Please give Mark a hand, a welcome. Coyote, welcome. To those of you who ever watched that silly TV show NCIS, we have a fellow named Mr. Dave Brandt, the former director of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. In my mind, he's one of the most transformational leaders I've ever seen, because he took hold of NCIS at a time when it was just responding. It was a small agency to the crisis involved with terrorism and the bombing of things like the USS Cole. He led the transformation and set the tone, a high ethical tone for that agency that caused all of those that worked for him, like Mark, to be sensitive to their responsibilities to the public. And an awful lot of what has happened since then and their success is due to the efforts of Mr. Brandt. Please welcome Dave Brandt. And certainly not last but not least is Mr. Alberto Moro. Alberto has a very distinguished legal career. He's currently at the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard University. He was the general counsel of the United States Information Agency, and during this time in question was the general counsel appointed by the Bush administration to be the general counsel of the United States Navy. He was the one that received the information from Mr. Brandt that something was going on that was inconsistent with our ethics, our morals, and our way of life. And Alberto will tell you his story, but he decided that as long as he was in that chair, would do everything he could every day of his life to stop that from happening. In recognition of his efforts, Alberto was given the Profiles in Courage Award by the J.F. Kennedy Institute at Harvard, very high distinguished award. We're extremely fortunate that he flew out from Boston just to be here with us. So please welcome. And I'm about done for the night here, because my job was to get it going and hand it over to my good friend and colleague, John McKay. John has also a very distinguished career, was president of something called Legal Services, a Washington agency, but most importantly, from this perspective, he was a United States attorney, a presidential appointee, a United States attorney from Seattle, Washington. In that position, he took on a tremendous number of high-level ethical issues of his time. And in fact, among the things he's most noteworthy for is that he was hired by the Bush administration to put in a program of high value in ethics, and he was unfortunately fired by the Bush administration because he decided what they were asking him to do was unethical. And he wears that as a badge of honor, and I am very, very proud to call him my friend and my colleague, John McKay. Mr. McKay, all yours.
I think I'm mic'd up and ready to go. Thank you. I think Dr. McQueenie pointed out that I'm going to serve as the moderator here, and the first thing I want to do is thank Cal State University San Bernardino for bringing this forum together, and the Department of Public Administration for bringing these three people together for us to listen to and engage in a dialogue. I think this is the first time the three of you have been together in a forum like this, where we have the agent who was on the ground at Guantanamo, we have the head of the agency who received the concerned communication from the agent, and we have the chief lawyer and in the chain of command for this agency in the Bush administration at the time that strange things began to happen at Guantanamo Bay, and I have to say other dark sites around the world. So this is an important issue for us in our country, and maybe it's got lessons, I think, that would apply broadly to everyone's lives in terms of ethical decision making. But we're going to just start here with a conversation about what happened, how we got to where we got today, and the importance of some of these issues. I want to start just by asking my friend Dave Brandt, who served as the director of NCIS. His career before that, Dave, you were an investigator. You were an NCIS agent. It was really your career to be a criminal investigator, overseen by district judges, always having to be accountable for your work. But you, during the time of post 9/11, began to hear something strange from your agents at Guantanamo Bay.
Yeah, John, first of all, echo John's remarks. Thanks for attending tonight. Hopefully we'll make this unique and conversational. Let me give a little context, because you're going to hear a lot about NCIS. Other than the TV show, which I'm sure most of you have seen, correct? I had a role in it. I'll be happy to replay that during the course of the evening. But for those of you who don't know much about the agency, and you're going to hear certainly Alberto, Mark, and I talk about it with John, let me give you a little context setting so you kind of understand this agency. As you'll hear from Mark, I was a career NCIS agent. I was there 30 years. I was the director from 97 until 2006, so almost 9 years. The agency, the easiest way to explain the agency is think of what you probably more commonly would know, the missions of FBI, DEA, Secret Service, ATF, CIA. There are pieces and parcels of each of those agencies that are part of NCIS. So for us, I think Mark would agree, the reason I stayed there for 30 years, because it has, as a federal law enforcement agency, probably the most interesting, fascinating, and really diverse mission of any agency. Global presence, 300 and some offices around the world, with a very, very compelling mission. Counterintelligence, counterterrorism, criminal, economic crime, et cetera. So civilian agent force. I worked for, as director, the Secretary of the Navy, through Alberto, who was the General Counsel of the Navy, and up through the chain within DOD. So we were a law enforcement agency, the investigative counterintelligence, counterterrorism arm, if you will, of the Navy Marine Corps. Civilian, special agent, FBI agent-like force, mostly civilians, almost 100% civilians. So to John's question, and I won't spend, he'll cut me off, he's already told me, so I won't spend too much more background time. NCIS as an agency you will never prepare for a 9/11, but we as an agency had undergone significant impact, as Dr. McQueenie mentioned, some transformational efforts as a result of the attack on Cole, the bombing on Cole.
Can you explain that just on the Cole? You mean the USS Cole?
The USS
and the
Cole,
bombing that occurred there.
12 October 2000, really the first of its kind where a terrorist attack on a U.S. naval vessel and 19 sailors are killed. That was a signal and a sign and an event that set a course of action in place that the country hadn't really thought of those types of actions against our resources. So as an organization...
Dave, can I interrupt you for a minute just so people understand that the attack on the Cole, the principal investigative responsibility would then fall to NCIS?
FBI has the primary terrorist responsibility jurisdictionally for any terrorist act involving U.S. interests, U.S. personnel. NCIS was the first agency on scene in Yemen. Mark was part of that investigation as well, and actually functioned as the initial responder, if you will, and then the biggest, I'd say, participant and contributor as a fact finder with the FBI and every other agency that's in existence. For us as an organization, probably as much as any organization, we saw up close and personal an event that really changed the course of how our government and our investigative intelligence apparatus reacted to attacks. So jumping forward, there's a lot between the attack on Cole and 9/11, but as an organization, and Mark being a key player of that, and also my relationship with Alberto, a key part of this, we as an organization had moved, to use the word we'll hear a lot tonight, and transformed in many ways in how we did business. And we may talk about that later, but we were, like every other organization on 9/11, involved in a massive response and part of task forces and an integrated effort around the country to not only react, but then proactively prevent, in whatever level and whatever method we could, future terrorist attacks. So jumping to Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, and again, I'm going to defer to Mark in a minute, as I'm sure John will. We, NCIS, when I say we, was part of a task force, an interrogation task force at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where...
And Guantanamo is administered by the Marine Corps.
It's actually a naval base.
Naval base. The Marine Corps has a
it's
unit there, at least.
Marine Corps had a unit, yeah. And again, not to get too much off track because I keep talking about Mark. He's going to give you the intimate details. I'm just going to give you the top level stuff. But we were part of a task force, joint task force. The services were there, intel agencies were there. There were multiple levels of interviewing / interrogating detainees as they were transferred from the battlefront and made their way to Guantanamo Bay for detention. And I know we're going to get back into some of the specifics, but in that process, our folks, under the oversight of Mark, a couple levels above, were part of interrogation teams where detainees would be interviewed for length of time to try to determine information of value, both to ongoing efforts, warfighter efforts, and evidence concerning crimes that may have been committed. And during that series of interviews over time, Mark, through others, brought directly to my attention, and then we'll get into my
And let me
connect
stop
with
you
Alberto.
there, because I think that's the best place to turn to Mark, who was on the ground at Guantanamo. So we have the context here that's been supplied. We've had the attacks of 9/11. Cole was attacked in 2000, right?
Correct.
2000. So in 9/11 now, we have the attacks of 9/11, the massive reaction of the government. We are now bringing prisoners to an American defense installation located in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, right?
Correct.
So we're bringing these high-value prisoners. They are prisoners. We're bringing them to a prison camp at Guantanamo Bay that the United States has established. You, NCIS, had at least one agent there, and I'm sure more than one.
We were members of a task force on the ground at Gitmo Bay with Army, Air Force, Navy, us, NCIS, DIA, CIA, FBI, all there contributing to these interviews and interrogations. And Mark can tell you the physical kind of separation of who did what.
Mark Fallon, tell us how it works so folks have some context here for the need the government. I think part of this is the need the government has to gather information from these people, and when the question comes to torture and other interrogation techniques that may not be torture, how do we get there? And so tell us what your responsibility was and what you observed.
Yeah, sure, John, and thanks, Dave, for the intro. To put it in context, of course, September 11th was a major event, of course, in most of our lifetimes. On September 14th, President Bush just declared a state of national emergency. And it's important to remember that because on September 17th, interestingly, 214 years after the Constitution was signed, the President made a decision he issued a classified finding that created the CIA's RDI program, Rendition, Detention, and Interrogation Program, none of which are core competencies of the CIA. A little while later, on the 13th of November 2001, the President issued an order that I just thought was amazing. He issued a military order that basically said that based on that state of a national emergency, based on the fact that the threat from Al-Qaeda actually risked the continuity of operations of the United States government, which is a significant phrase. That means your succession planning from the presidency on down to continue for our government to function, that he gave the Department of Defense the primary responsibility to investigate, detain, and try before military commission anyone who is or was a member of Al-Qaeda, anyone who aided, abetted, or knowingly harbored the Al-Qaeda network. That military order went to the Secretary of Defense, to the Secretary of the Army, to the Commanding General of Army CID, and landed in my lap. And so I became the government, for lack of a better term, the chief investigator for Al-Qaeda for about 2.5 years. And that task force, called the Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Task Force, reported right up to the Secretary of Defense, had 3 primary responsibilities. The first one, and just to correct my former boss Dave, we were an investigative task force, not an interrogation task force. And I'll differentiate that for a reason, because an interrogation is a piece of an investigation, whereas interrogators just interrogate for information. So our primary job to start with was to do preliminary investigations to determine, to give the President what was called a reason to believe determination. So our principal job was to do interviews, and while we talk about Guantanamo, it was a global task force. Our headquarters was at Fort Belvoir. We have forward deployed elements in Afghanistan, Guantanamo, later Iraq. We went globally. We sent people into Yemen, we sent people into Afghanistan, all over the world, doing investigations, which an interrogation is a part of.
Mark, can I just interject here?
Yeah,
One
sure.
of the major concerns, as I understand it, was that we feared additional attacks, either in the United States or on United States assets. So one of the reasons we had sort of a global investigation occurring here was fear of another attack. Is that something that you experienced?
Yeah, it definitely was. I mean, everyone was fearful at the time, and there was, frankly, a lot of bad intelligence being put out at that time that later was determined to be inaccurate.
Bad intelligence that we may be facing an attack, or an attack was imminent, something along
Well, we all feared it. If you look at the Al-Qaeda methodology, there are waves of attacks, so it wasn't unwarranted. But my belief is, then and in hindsight, is basically it was a policy that was born of fear, a little bit of ignorance, and some arrogance as well.
You were trained as an investigative agent.
Correct.
Right? So you're used to the idea that you would be, in essence, supervised by, in the end, by someone who's going to have to try a case to a judge or to somebody else. You had to learn the ways of obtaining evidence that could be admissible in court, and therefore obtained in a way that respected the rights of individuals. I want to make sure people understand this was the training you had, this was the training that Dave Brandt had as an agent, correct?
Yeah, and not only training, the experience. I mean, I worked the case on the blind sheikh, Omar Abdel-Rahman, in New York, who was going to blow up the United Nations in 26 Federal Plaza. I had worked that case back in the early 90s, and then I was the commander of the Cole Task Force. So I had quite a bit of experience running investigations against terrorists, overseeing interrogations of terrorists, taking that, and remember, the NCIS role is not just a criminal investigative organization, it's a counterintelligence organization. So the job is not only to collect evidence, it's to collect intelligence for threat warning information, protect the fleet, the Navy and Marine Corps. So it's kind of that dual role, and Dave spoke about the uniqueness of the organization. There really is no organization that I know totally like NCIS that really has the type of mission that we did in the manner in which we did it. So from the CITF perspective, my first role was to give, only the president would decide who went for military commissions. So we had to do, we call them reason to believe determinations. We would have to go and do an investigation and look at all the results of everyone else's intelligence.
But so far, Mark, you've described a process that would be like other criminal investigations that you participated in.
Correct.
You even named a couple. But something changed at Guantanamo, didn't it?
Can I interrupt one more time? Sorry. Even though you referred to me as your former boss. I caught that. I think one thing to keep in mind, and I know all of you, probably some of this is getting too process-oriented, but keep in mind what was unique here, and it'll come up later when we get Alberto involved, is Mark, although an NCIS agent, did not work for me. He did not report to me. This was an effort, the task force was a coming together of people from different agencies, different backgrounds, different skill sets, different training, and they were under the control of the Army. So you guys probably know how when task forces come together, there's an entity that owns that task force, the people detached from their parent organization. So this effort was an integrated group of expertise from all different organizations. So I gave up people, if you will, from NCIS who went under the control of the Army for the purposes of this task force, as Mark was. So that comes into play later because those individuals, just like probably different entities in this area, when they all come together towards a common mission, they're certainly focused on the mission, but they come with different backgrounds, different skill sets, different histories. So that's always a bit of a challenge, no matter where you are.
Yes.
Thanks for that. But in terms of the investigation that you described so far, that it's part of a normal, you would even be able to say it was part of what you would think of as using your normal investigative skills.
Investigative and counterintelligence skills. The task force was 230 personnel. It was criminal investigators, it was intelligence analysts, it was behavioral scientists, it was lawyers, but it was a combination of what I would do as a criminal investigator and a counterintelligence operative.
In any of your other cases, had you worked on anything quite this massive? You're describing kind of a massive gathering of assets to Guantanamo and the worldwide effort to obtain intelligence and to obtain information that could be acted upon. Am I right
Correct.
about that?
Correct.
So this was bigger than anything you'd done before, but you started
By
to hear
far.
something that was quite a bit different from how you would normally conduct an investigation. Can you tell us about that?
Well, sure. We had liaison personnel at CIA, and I actually had CIA people supporting me on the CITF. And so we started hearing from our network about the techniques that were being used on detainees.
Okay, techniques being used on detainees.
Yeah, what was called the
What were you hearing?
Yeah, EITs. Well, we were told that they were being abused and that they were practicing techniques that were concerning to me. Now, we had different missions, but my mission, my orders were from the President through the Secretary of Defense to conduct criminal investigation for trial before military commissions. And those orders actually said you will treat detainees humanely, they will be clothed, given food, and medical treatment. So the
But
thing...
tell us what you were hearing.
Yeah.
What were you hearing? You're at Guantanamo, and you're beginning to hear something that's happening in different locations than you're working at Guantanamo. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, tell us what you heard.
Correct. We heard about significant abuse. And I'm not sure what's been declassified regarding that abuse, but we heard about waterboarding.
We just saw
Yeah.
some stuff on the mainstream media, and it's been declassified in the Senate report. So tell us something
Sure. Well,
consistent with those
Well,
reports.
it would be EITs. It would be SEER techniques.
EITs, enhanced interrogation techniques.
Well, I actually call it excuses to inflict torture, but if you'd like to use the
Okay.
CIA vernacular, we will call it enhanced interrogation. There was nothing enhanced about them. And what had happened was the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency, JPRIA, which is responsible for the SEER program, which is a program to inoculate our service members to prepare them for the techniques from a brutal regime. So what the CIA had done was they took 2 SEER psychologists and they didn't really enhance the techniques, they just adopted them. So they looked at the manner, and SEER was actually
Let
developed...
me see if I can get this
Yeah.
straight. We have trained some of our military officers who might be subject to capture by, regimes that might employ torture, things that we wouldn't do.
Correct.
And in order to prepare them for this, we have subjected them to the kind of psychological preparedness they might need should they be
Yes.
captured, correct?
In small controlled dosage
Okay.
to prepare them in what they might expect. And really the goal is to give them confidence to get through this.
So we had psychologists, you're telling us that psychologists familiar with those techniques designed to help them defend against their use. They've decided that maybe we can take some of these techniques and use them ourselves. Did I hear you right?
Yeah, that is absolutely
Okay,
accurate.
now can you describe for us what you were hearing was being done? Were they saying EITs, were they saying enhanced, or did you start to hear about things that they were doing to some of the prisoners there?
No, both.
Well, tell us about what you heard was going on.
And I was aware of the fact that they were marketing the EITs because they marketed them to me.
Marketing, I don't know what that
Yeah.
means. It sounds like they're selling hot dogs. What-
I would call it selling voodoo science, but
Okay.
we'll use hot dogs.
They're trying to sell you on the idea
Yeah.
that they have a new way to interrogate these guys, these prisoners, and it's
Correct.
great stuff, and you should be trying it. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. The chief of staff from the JPRA came to me, the deputy commander of my task force, and said, hey, we want to tell you about SEER. I said, it's fantastic, let me hear about it. And he explained what it was. And I said, that's great, but I don't envision my guys getting captured, and I really don't think that my NCS guys and CID guys want, and they said, no, that's an interrogation technique. I said, wait a minute, that's not interrogation, that's a counter-interrogation technique. Why would I want to use that? I know how to interrogate. I know how to do this job. I've done this before with terrorists. Appreciate your help. I never imagined anyone would actually say, that's a good idea. They actually went to the CIA, they went to DOD. Some people adopted and accepted it. I rejected it outright.
At some point, though, Mark, you had a conversation with someone, and the hair stood up on the back of your neck. Somebody was letting you know that some new techniques were being employed at Guantanamo that would have involved, in your mind, grave concerns about their legality, whether they were enhanced interrogation techniques, or we can just say the word torture, right?
Correct.
And
It was
you
torture.
began to think that was happening, and maybe it was even confirmed for you. Can you tell us about that? What
Yes,
was it
sure.
that you heard? Not EITs, not possible torture.
Yeah.
Tell us what you heard was going on.
Yeah, so as we went down the road with the task force, we identified a detainee named Mohammed Al-Qahtani, detainee 63. He actually would have been most likely one of the 20th hijacker. He tried to enter the country, he was a Saudi, tried to enter the country in Orlando, Florida, was turned away by a very astute immigrations inspector who felt he seemed like an assassin. he didn't answer the questions right about who he was visiting or someone who was picking him up. Muhammad Atta was actually waiting outside to pick them up, so he was actually sent back. He was later...
Muhammad Atta was one of the pilots and died. In
Exactly. He was kind of the on-site cell leader for the 9/11 attacks. And so when we identified Katani as a 20th hijacker, he certainly became a high priority target for both investigation and intelligence.
He was a prisoner at Guantanamo.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And so from a understanding the Al-Qaeda framework, he would have been a muscle hijacker. That would have been not a pilot, someone who would have been there to subdue the crew. Most likely, he would have been on the flight that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Obviously, someone we're very concerned about. We want to know what he knows. What did you hear was happening to him?
Yeah, well, we actually came up with a methodology to interrogate Katani. My goal, and it was a DoD operation. The FBI were guests down at Guantanamo, and the general reminded them of that constantly. So they had more of a secondary role. It was the JTF-170, the predecessor of JTF Guantanamo, and CITF had the DoD intelligence responsibility and the DoD investigative
Let me just ask you
responsibility.
something, Mark. You're awesome at this, but DoD and these people don't, most people are not going to know what you're talking about. So let's skip the JTTFs and DoDs and we'll just talk about people. You're doing great on the people thing. So let's go to that. I do this myself, but let's,
10-4?
yeah. You've got Katani, and you've got a plan for him, which is consistent with your normal investigative protocols, or in some way. But you're going to learn that he's being treated differently by some of the others at Guantanamo. That's the part we want to get to.
Yeah. So to ensure that everyone's equities are protected, we decided let's let the FBI do their interview first, because it might apply to some existing 9/11 case. That's not a DoD case. And we want to ensure that the evidence is collected purely. There's no fruits of the poisonous tree. It's not tainted. And then the secondary interviews will be done by the CITF. We would do a follow-on because we need to ensure that we have the information from Military Commission. He's in DoD custody.
So FBI, with FBI agents, your group, which is the specially designated group for the Department of Defense, but
Correct.
again, with federal agents in them. But now you're going to tell us about a third group.
Correct. And
That also was
that's
going to interrogate
the
him.
JTF-170.
Which-
This is the military task force responsible for the collection of evidence, for intelligence from detainees at Gitmo. So you had 3 competing task forces,
Right.
all looking at the information a little
The
differently.
part we want to know from you is, what did you learn was happening in that third group?
correct.
What tactics were they employing?
Yeah. So as we went down the road with Katani, we got some very good information. The FBI agents did a very good job. We got some great admissions from Katani. We understood, and we knew his role before that. I mean, from an intelligence collection perspective, we already knew what we needed to know about Katani. So really what we were learning was the evidence. We were getting admissions from him.
These were normal investigative techniques of interrogation.
Correct, the same way
The
we
kind
did
that
with
any
the
police
Cole
officer would
suspects.
use if you had someone who robbed a bank, who was engaged in a violent crime, had stolen property. You ask these kinds of questions when you have a suspect, right?
Or that we've done with previous terrorists before,
Okay,
and Al-Qaeda terrorists.
all right, so you did that with Katani.
Right. So the military task force, the JTF task force from the military, was growing impatient and decided that they needed to ramp it up. And there was a momentum. They were very frustrated because they were not very effective at collecting intelligence. They didn't realize that many of the detainees at Guantanamo actually had no intelligence. An overwhelming majority of the people who we had at Guantanamo actually didn't do anything wrong. My estimation, there's probably about 100 and so bad guys down there out of 750 that we probably had in total. A lot of them were bounty babies, picked up, sold to us for bounty. They weren't screened very effectively in Afghanistan. And while Guantanamo was supposed to be for the worst of the worst, it really became a place for the unluckiest. And so with Katani, you had a very frustrated general down there who was at the end of his tour, who was increasingly wanting to ramp up and employ the techniques that they were hearing, that we were all hearing the CIA was using.
Such as?
Such as waterboarding, the SEER techniques that I described earlier.
Waterboarding is one.
Walling.
Walling. Tell us what walling is.
It's slamming someone into a wall.
Slamming someone into a wall. Waterboarding, we're going to come back to in a moment. We're going to have a description of
Correct.
waterboarding. But walling, you really mean taking someone and physically slamming their body against the wall
Exactly.
repeatedly.
Yeah, a stomach slap or a face slap, which would be an open-handed blow to the body.
Okay.
Things that, use of phobias.
I'm sorry?
Phobias. People
Phobias.
were
Well,
afraid
I've
of
got
insects.
phobias, and a lot of people have phobias. What is the use of phobias?
If you're afraid of insects, putting people in a box with insects, use of dogs, detaining.
If my greatest fear was fear of rats, and by the way, it is. You
Good to
could set
know.
up a phobia box for me, couldn't you? You could put a rat at the end of a long tube, and you could have the rat come running down the tube right at my face. It could be taped to my face, right?
I'm envisioning that right now, John.
Okay, so that could be my phobia. That could be my phobia box. But this is what you're talking about when you're talking about phobia. So you're talking about trying to identify the thing that your target fears, and then putting them into a box or some other situation in which they cannot escape the thing they're most afraid of.
Yeah, and I know for the audience, you probably don't want me to get too technical, but there's a theory, it's called learned helplessness. I call it forced helplessness. It's actually a theory that was practiced on dogs by a psychologist named Seligman, who was actually a former president of the APA, which basically said, and this was the theory, this is how they enhanced what the communists, what
Yeah, I
the
don't
North
think we need the
Koreans did
theory
to
on
us.
this, because I think it's scary enough that you get put in a box with insects, or I've got my rat coming at me down the thing. So we know that these tactics. Anything else? Any other tactics that we need to know about?
But what's important to know is the goal is to break your will. So the use of phobia, it's actually to, and it was done with dogs to show that if you constantly abuse them, no matter what they did, they would be obedient after that. So in my mind, they confused control with cooperation.
Okay, yeah, and at this point, we don't really care why they're confused. We just want to know what they were doing.
Yeah.
So we've got at least these three techniques. Were there others that you were concerned about?
Anything that was tantamount to an assault. I mean, I heard they had, they were threatening with people with drill bits, mock executions, threatening them to rape their families.
Was there any one of these items that in your mind said, I need to go up the chain of command here, because I'm hearing things now that are occurring, although I'm not engaged in them, I'm hearing about them here, and I need the people up my chain of command to hear about. Was there any one thing that happened?
Yeah.
What was that?
It was when the general counsel from the CIA, a guy named John Fredman, actually came to Guantanamo Bay. And he came a week after a visit from Alberto Gonzales, David Addington, Michael
These were top
Chertoff.
officials in the Bush administration.
Correct, and Bill Haynes. And so what I had seen there is whenever those officials came down to Guantanamo, some major shift in the way we treated people occurred. And so when they went down, my goal was to go down and talk them out of it, because I saw the momentum building, I saw what the JTF was doing. And so I tried to go down there, and I actually worked for Bill Haynes and never met Bill Haynes. But I went down there to try to intercede and tell them there was another way to do business, and the general prevented me from actually meeting with, guy was my boss.
So you became convinced that there was something very improper occurring at Guantanamo, is that right?
Well, when the CIA came and basically said that it's subject to perception, if a detainee dies, you're doing it wrong, that anything short of death was fine. When the Judge Advocate General, the senior lawyer for the general, basically said, we needed immunity in advance, I said, if you're doing nothing wrong, why would you need immunity in advance?
Let me stop you there,
Yeah.
because we know that you communicated up your chain of command. It went through David Brandt, but it came to Alberto Mora as the General Counsel of the Navy, who now has learned of these activities through Dave Brandt.
Let me say something. Sorry to interrupt you. But anybody know that John's a lawyer? Could you tell his little prosecutor? Did anybody ever pick that up? Let me say, I'll make this quick, I promise. So I heard bits and pieces of what Mark just described in great detail. It took me probably a minute for the following reasons to go to Alberto Mora and say, this has got to stop. A, we're doing criminal investigations. These are interrogations. They're relationship-based. We're trying to capture evidence for use in future prosecutions. They're ineffective. Whatever you think, it's ineffective. This is not working. What we have seen work is relationship-based interviews over time. So the whole philosophy of what was going on didn't add up. B, of course, when you talked anything physical, whichever one of those techniques and wherever category you put those in regarding torture, I immediately said to myself, my folks I'm responsible for at NCIS, representing the Department of the Navy, will not, cannot, and won't participate, period. Didn't need to hear, even as much as you heard today, didn't need to hear that. I will tell you, I went straight to Alberto Mora, who is my reporting senior, with some level of trepidation, because I knew, as Mark accurately described here, this thing is going to create lots of issues. There are lots of players way above me, lots of players in all aspects of government, both DOD and beyond, that were going to get involved potentially with what was going on there. So I will tell you up front, I had second thoughts, even though I already had the highest regard and respect for Alberto, about what I was dumping literally in his lap and what I thought we should do versus where's the political apparatus going to take this thing.
Well, let's
So
stop
with
there.
that backdrop, I went to Alberto.
And it was sort of, as Dave Brandt just said, dumped in your lap. And we're very interested to know what you did when this was dumped in your lap. And I think it's appropriate that Mark just was mentioning the legal standard really being articulated by his visitor from the CIA, which the standard, the legal standard for torture as adopted by the Bush administration was organ failure or imminent death. And so that he literally was saying to them, if they haven't died, then you haven't done anything wrong yet. That was the definition of torture. But you had to become aware of all of these issues. You certainly became aware that the agency reporting to you, NCIS, was now at least aware of information firsthand from Guantanamo that perhaps torture was being undertaken by the United States government. What response did you have?
Well, first of all, let me say that by this time, this is November 2002, I had developed a great deal of confidence in Dave individually and NCIS, particularly through the way they'd handled the Cole investigation. I got to see the extraordinary professionalism of the organization and had just bedrock, solid confidence in Dave. By the way, these guys, as you've seen, are not only extraordinarily capable law enforcement professionals, but they're also comedians. So, so this is it became, Dave warned me when I came on board the Navy. He says, look, you may not know anything about us, but I'll tell you what I told other general counsels before you, that you'll be spending a lot more time with me than you might think. And so it proved. But
you weren't expecting this, were you?
Yeah, I wasn't
This is not
expecting
what
this.
you were expecting.
So Dave takes me aside. We were together in a meeting on something entirely different, and after the meeting is finished, he takes me aside to a corner of my office, and he says, look, we're hearing rumors that detainees are being abused in Guantanamo. Do you want to hear more? So it's a very elegant way for Dave to tee this up. And it was an escape. He was giving me an escape, you know, abuse, but maybe you don't want to get engaged. I didn't know what Dave was talking about, but as soon as he said the word abuse, I mean, it's like, it was really, our response to him was, I do, and he kind of nodded. He says, okay, we'll be back tomorrow. Give you the full brief. They came back, Dave, delegation, NCIS, the chief psychologist of NCIS was there as well. I invited my Navy JAG and Marine Corps counterpart. And then the story.
Can I stop you here for 1 second? I just
Yeah.
want to stop you for 1 second because I think there's something maybe people here are noticing. 3 moments that have just happened here. Mark Fallon has had the hair stand up on the back of his neck. He knows now that there is torture being undertaken in the same base where you're working. You communicate this to Dave Brandt, who has a moment that says, wait, I've been trained in a way, I'm never going to allow this to occur while I'm the director of NCIS. And then he comes to you, and you're standing in your office, and you have this moment, the word is abuse, but you know what he's talking about. And you have,
I didn't know what he was talking
but you have a suspicion that this is a very serious issue, abuse at Guantanamo.
Any abuse
Yeah.
anywhere in the system is a matter of concern to a lawyer.
And so in each of these moments, each of you had to take some action, and the action now is yours.
For me, I always saw my duty as a general counsel of the Navy, as general counsel for any organization, I've done this now a number of times, is to fly to potential illegality, to potential abuse. So for me, it was an automatic response to the description that they. But then when they came in next morning and described what they had learned
Now, as described to me is, we haven't seen this, but we've learned enough to know that we think that what's called force creep, which is the
Say that word again, I'm sorry.
force creep.
Force
It's the-
creep, okay.
The term of art in the literature of interrogation, that if you give an interrogator license to apply brutality, the level of brutality will continue to increase until such time as it reaches a level of cruel and human and degrading treatment and torture. Both cruel and human and degrading treatment and torture are legal terms of art, defined terms of art under American statute and international law. And they had gone snooping, you know, as Mark indicated and Dave indicated, they tapped into the other task force computers and they presented me with.
Tap is such a harsh word out there.
Okay, they stole it. They stole the, they had fragments of the interrogation transcript. The individuals were not identified. I never knew it was Katani until years later,
I see.
as a matter of fact. I had no idea who this individual was or what he had done, why he was being interrogated in this fashion. And the fragment which they presented to me then didn't contain any cruel treatment. This was the portion of the interrogation where women were taunting him. They were putting women's underwear on his head, and they clearly had exceeded the line, so it lent credibility to what NCIS was reporting was going on in Guantanamo. Then after discussing this at some length, then one of the last comments which they made was, I think Dave said this, was, oh, by the way, we've also heard rumors that this has been approved at the highest levels in Washington, but we haven't seen any paper on this issue. You know, the brief was finished, we all sat there, and my response was, this is potentially explosive. It reflects behavior that appears to be illegal, contrary to our values, and would be very damaging to the country if, in fact, we were abusing prisoners in this fashion in Guantanamo. And I said, look, I don't know how to go about this, but I'll look into this. And in fact, I didn't know how to go about this. There was only one person I knew who might have some knowledge on this, which was the Army General Counsel. As Dave and Mark have indicated, Army was the executive agent, the delegate of the Secretary of Defense in handling interrogations in Guantanamo and elsewhere. So I called this individual up. Now, as a lawyer, you call people up all the time, and you say, look, what's going on, as I did. Army General Counsel on the telephone. This is exactly the very next day after this last meeting. And I said, Steve Morello, the Army General Counsel, Steve, I'm hearing rumors that detainees are being abused in Guantanamo. Do you know anything about this? Now, this is the question that you ask a million times in your legal career, and the answer is always no. This guy could be in Guantanamo with a whip in one hand, but he'd be saying, what, Guantanamo, detainees, abuse, don't know anything about it. But to my shock, he said, I know a lot about it. Why don't you come on down? Down to his office, which was on the floor immediately below me. We went down next day, and he pushed across the table was a document stack. The lowest document was a request from the commander of Guantanamo for the application of counter-resistance interrogation techniques, and that, which included all the techniques that Mark had indicated here before, including sensory deprivation was another one of the techniques that was caught my eye at that moment. And then below that was a memorandum of law written by the Army Lieutenant Colonel, which was a senior lawyer in Guantanamo, who essentially found that all these techniques and all this treatment was consistent with U.S. and international law. Above that was a memorandum from the commander of Southern Command, which was in the chain of command up to the Secretary of Defense. Then there was a memorandum to the Joint Staff, and then the top memorandum was a memo from Jim Haynes, the DoD General Counsel, to Donald Rumsfeld, requesting authorization from the Secretary of Defense to apply these counter-resistance interrogation techniques to the
So for
Guantanamo
people
case.
here, you're talking about a consistent upward push of documentation that seemed to be justifying your concern that
Yes.
harsh interrogation techniques were being used, and they seemed to be authorized at every level? Is this
Exactly.
what you were
In
saying?
fact, it was 4 levels. Even though the Joint Staff never completed its review, it had reached 4 different legal offices and had been approved or not objected to by each one of those offices.
Was
But
this
the top
significant
memo-
to you in the way you were thinking about this potential problem?
Well, it became significant because as I looked at this thing and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld's signature, and then the handwritten notation at the very bottom of the page which said, I stand at my desk between 6 and 8 hours a day. Why are they, meaning the detainees, limited to standing 4 to 6 hours?
So this is a technique that is called wall standing. Would this be the wall standing? There is a technique of standing which requires you to lean out, use
Well,
your fingertips. Is this the same one?
No, actually, they would handcuff people with their hands above their heads or between their legs so that
Okay,
you
so
could
very-
not fall asleep.
Very uncomfortable position, which over time is excruciating. I mean,
Yes,
I
correct.
can say I know this for a fact. So you're seeing authorizations
Yes.
that go up to and include the Secretary of Defense.
Right. And I didn't have the time to read the memorandum, the entire memorandum, and absorb it when I was there talking about this with Steve Morello, but I was thumbing through it very quickly because what I was looking for almost immediately was words of limitation. So I was looking somewhere in the memorandum, there had to be words that instructed the military that you may apply these techniques, but
But you
only
must stop at a certain
at a certain point.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you may not exceed the threshold, cross the threshold of cruel and human degrading treatment. That, by the way, is the American standard. We're talking here about torture, but as we all know as Americans, what we are forbidden from applying to individuals in captivity is cruelty, which is a lower standard of abuse. That's also the international legal standard. That's the human rights standard. So when we talk about torture, when I talk about torture, please understand that I'm really talking about cruelty, a much lower level of abuse that I regard as equally prohibited as torture. But those words of limitation were nowhere in the memorandum. So as I was looking at the memorandum, what dawned on me was that this document authorized torture, potentially, depending how these techniques were applied.
You must have thought, I can't believe what I'm seeing here.
I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but it struck me, it never crossed my mind that it was anything other than a simple mistake. After 9/11, all of us at the Pentagon were working around the clock. Jim Haynes, the general counsel who had written this memorandum seeking authorization, was working literally around the clock, and on a number of occasions had fallen asleep at the wheel driving home from the Pentagon. So he got into his office every morning to find a 3-foot stack of paper, and then poor Secretary Rumsfeld found a 4-foot stack of paper in this morning, and I thought, I was utterly convinced of this. This is just a simple mistake. Jim Haynes just didn't read this memorandum closely
You're just
enough.
such a nice guy, Alberto.
I never.
Because to think that it was a mistake, now as you look back, you
No,
know, of course, that's
well,
not, that's not
what
what it
happened
was.
is the day after this, so Dave comes in, tells me about this, then comes in the following day, and then the day after that, I find the memorandum, and the day after that, I called Jim Haynes and said, I want a meeting, and I'm in his office that afternoon, and I pushed back the memorandum at him, and I said, Jim, this authorizes torture. And he says, no, it doesn't. And then I spoke for an hour, and he said almost nothing. He said almost nothing. But then he didn't have to, because I felt that as an attorney, if somebody points out a mistake to you, then
You want to correct it.
you want to correct it immediately. It's like, so I pointed out what was certainly a grave mistake in legal professionalism. They had missed the critical legal issues in the analysis. They'd authorized the nation and the Secretary of Defense to authorize techniques that could potentially lead to torture.
Was there a moment in the review of these documents or in your briefing presented by NCIS through Dave Brandt in which you concluded we have committed torture, knowingly,
No.
purposefully?
I didn't know the level of abuse. We had evidence that there was abuse being perpetrated, but they had no information to reach the decision that we had in fact tortured.
So your concern at this point is that they've made a mistake, a
Legally.
legal mistake, and they're probably
Legally.
advising them wrongly.
Correctly.
Wrong.
The document was wrong legally. As a matter of,
Yeah.
of legal professionalism, legal draftsmanship, this document was not sufficiently circumscribed. It was not limited as it should have been under U.S. law.
But you were concerned something was going to happen because of that.
Something was happening under that. I didn't know
Turns
the
out
extent
something
of it.
very bad was happening under that.
Exactly,
Yeah.
but I didn't really know the extent of it. I had no idea of knowing. But back to the point of being a nice guy, it never occurred to me, and to this day I find it bizarre to understand that American lawyers would actually authorize the use of cruelty. To me, to this day, it remains a shocking thought. It had never entered my mind at that point that any American lawyer would knowingly authorize the application of cruelty in any circumstance.
Dave Brandt,
Let me after a comment, because I think
Yeah.
what you just said is important. And so I'm going to take this to a personal level here. So, you know, this is a time of tremendous stress and intensity, and the country is really at war on a number of levels. And you think back now and you talk about this, what Mark described, there was a lot of support to do what he was noticing and had concerns about. In other words, it was in the moment, let's do whatever it takes. We can't have this happen again. Aggressive as we can be. You heard some of the comments people made there.
We were being told at the Justice Department that the gloves were coming off.
Right. So there's a sort of a, you know, I don't want to say herd mentality, but there was sort of a, we got to do whatever it takes. And Mark and others stopped and said, wait a minute, this isn't right. There was nothing compelling him to do that. Nobody pointed that out, what you heard him say. He, on a personal level, got to a point where what he had heard and picked up on and felt and saw, he had to take action on it. A lot of others didn't. When it came to me, and we've had this conversation, I could have said, yeah, thanks, Mark. You don't really report to me. Geez, go tell the Army. I'm not getting, this is outside my pay grade. And I don't know what happened to bring us all together, but I had the absolute opposite thought, which was, as Mark knows, I called the commander of the task force and said, without knowledge of actual torture, but if what we're hearing is true, our guys are out of there. I'm pulling them out, period. Unilaterally, just taking every single NCIS agent is coming back.
Dave, let me ask you, at that moment, did you think that might happen, that you would
Yeah,
have to pull
oh
them
yeah,
out?
I thought it would happen because part 3, you've heard a little bit. I've worked for quite a few political appointees in my tenure as director. Not a shot about anyone in particular, but a somewhat cautious, what's this mean to me career-wise lot, if I can put him in that category.
That's exactly the question I wanted to ask you. You must have had a thought that if you had pulled those agents out, the head of the executive branch of the government is the President of the United States, George W. Bush, right? It would have been on the front page of the newspaper in no time that you pulled the agents from Guantanamo because you didn't agree with interrogation techniques being undertaken by other agencies.
Yeah, but you know how to blame it on Mark.
You probably would have. You stood at that moment, you stood at that career over moment, didn't you?
Yeah, there was a little bit of that, but not a lot, but a little. But I think what's most important between Mark and Alberto is actually Alberto, because those of you who haven't served in D.C. or been in an environment where no matter what role you're in, there's always a lot of people that are in a more powerful role. Whatever you're head of, there's a bunch of others that are above you. Alberto's in a very prestigious, very important position, but you heard as he described this, there's a lot of interested players on this topic in all levels of the government. At about day 3, he's deceptively aggressive. You would never pick that up. He's more a diplomat than a kick in the door and arrest somebody kind of personality like he is. But I'm going to tell you, as this began to take form, there was absolutely no doubt, no hesitation, no even remote thought from him. And when I watched him, I'm taking this to the limit. Because at every point he would find something as he began to describe that he just couldn't believe. At any point, hey,
Mark, did you feel at some point that by passing this information, you were putting people at risk or your career at risk?
Oh yeah, absolutely. All of those levels that Alberto described, I had gone to first.
Yeah.
I was detailed away from NCIS, so I had already gone.
But you'd seen other agents in your career do what you were just doing, and what happened to them? And did their careers advance after having blown the whistle on this kind of thing?
Not
in
at
your
this
experience?
level. I've taken on admirals and generals in the past, as any NCIS agent would do through their career.
Sure, because you investigated them, but an agent who is going to complain at this level is probably not going to be marked for advancement.
Yeah,
Am I right?
I could tell you at the time I was not a very popular guy. I was looked at as unpatriotic. People would tell me, the Secretary of Defense has approved this. And of course, my response was, we swore allegiance to the Constitution, not the Secretary.
But they said you were unpatriotic.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, one of the three of you eventually lost their job over this issue. And I'm going to turn to my friend Alberto Mora and say, what price did you pay for speaking up about this and requiring this information to come to you and then providing the legal background for those others in the Department of Defense?
Actually, I didn't pay a price for this. If anything, my career has been enhanced. I happen to be, strangely enough, probably the senior-most attorney in the Bush administration who objected to the enhanced interrogation. Now, the legal professional, almost in its totality, is of the view that
I'm not sure the mic is picking up your...
this was,
so people can hear you.
in fact, this was a gross abdication of their professional responsibility. Talking about senior attorneys in the Bush administration, starting with the White House counsel, Attorney General, Office of Legal Counsel, and then the general counsels in the Department of Defense, but also CIA and a number of other places.
These are people that
Nobody
signed
said-
off on these.
These are people who signed
torture
off on it. The National Security Council, CIA, went back to the National Security Council on 3 separate occasions, and the full National Security Council reapproved the application of enhanced interrogation as a matter of policy. The lawyers had already signed off on this, so the Department of Justice was always firm that these were legal.
When you say enhanced interrogation, are you talking about both the cruel kind of punishment and what you would consider to be torture?
Enhanced interrogation, as the term, the euphemism applied by the Bush administration
Yeah.
to characterize this thing, as what it is now, as Mark and David have indicated, it's torture. It's just simply torture. The way the CIA treated each of those individuals, 119 of them, in their custody, and hundreds of individuals who were abused in Department of Defense custody as well, using techniques influenced by the CIA, these kinds of techniques. Many of them were also tortured as well.
But you know from your standpoint, either as a lawyer, that you cannot allow torture to occur because that's illegal. And you know that to use cruel punishment would violate other United States laws.
That's exactly right.
So you're against that. But as a human being, you must have had thoughts about this as well.
Well, it's important to realize that nobody is without rights. The most important rights we all have is the right to have rights. And after that, then there's a basket of protected rights that define human dignity, and the right to be free from cruelty is one of those paramount rights. If we don't have the right to be free from cruelty, all the other rights are insignificant or immaterial. That right has to be protected. And when the United States decided we're going to apply waterboarding to Mohammed al-Qahtani and others, or the other senior al-Qaeda detainees, that necessarily meant that all people don't have inalienable individual rights, including the right to be free from cruelty, which is a massively important retreat from our values and our laws.
You saw one of the speakers here, Alberto, say that perhaps one of the reasons, he seemed to imply anyway on the video, that one of the reasons we employed these techniques was because over 3,000 Americans were dead.
No question.
Is,
There's no
is,
question.
is that,
All of us felt in the Pentagon that these individuals had opted out of the human race and were capable of savagery at even greater numbers. Our boss, the Secretary of the Navy, Gordon England, said he figured out why the al-Qaeda had killed 3,000 individuals. He paused for a moment to say, because they couldn't figure out how to kill 30,000 individuals. And that's a statement of fact.
so some might say to you, in response to the comments that you just gave, that these people are not entitled to these kinds of rights.
And I'd say they were wrong.
So
I'd say they're
why are
absolutely
they wrong?
I've wrestled with this question myself at my office in the Pentagon. I'd sit back and, as we were engaged on the issue, and we learned fairly quickly that it wasn't a simple mistake. I was on Christmas vacation, so this was late November. Christmas vacation was down in Miami with my mother's, literally in the pool, when I get a phone call from Dave saying, "Oh, remember we thought we'd solved the problem." Well, I'm calling to say that detainees are still being abused. It became evident that this was not a simple legal mistake, not a simple oversight on the part of individuals. It was still a mistake. It was a mistake legally and from a policy standpoint, but it was not inadvertent. People deliberately
They did
sought
this
to
on
apply
purpose.
these kinds of techniques.
Mark, let me ask you this. There are some who say that we would conduct these techniques against people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed because he was directly responsible for killing so many Americans, and it's punishment. Alberto says that's wrong, that violates. Investigators might say, and I've heard some do say this, that because we use these techniques, torture, we got valuable information that helped and supported United States security. Do you think that that is true, that sometimes torture does provide actionable intelligence, the kind of intelligence that might prevent another attack, or are these people wrong?
Well, I can't say it never would provide any actual intelligence. The problem is it will obtain so much information you will not be able to determine accurate and reliable intelligence from inaccurate intelligence. And I know that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed did not provide that intelligence because I was the one doing the reason to believe.
You realize that the former Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, would say that you're absolutely wrong. Because I've heard him say many times that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the mastermind of 9/11, provided valuable intelligence directly as a result of waterboarding him. Now, is the Vice President wrong?
Well, I can tell you I wrote an op-ed for Political Magazine that said Dick Cheney is lying about torture.
Dick Cheney's lying about torture. So we know your
Exactly.
viewpoint that the Vice President is wrong.
Correct.
Do you think you can speak for... Yeah, go ahead, Alberto.
I'm going to interject a couple of things. I left this out earlier, but part of the message that NCIS gave me on that first larger meeting was that not only was this illegal and contrary to American laws and values, but it was unprofessional. This was amateurish. These people were actually in impeding our ability to gain important intelligence rather than enhancing our ability to gain.
Wait, so are you telling me they were bad torturers?
Well, yeah, exactly. They were bad torturers and bad interrogators.
Well, what people don't understand is the people who designed the RDI program for the CIA were not interrogation professionals. They did not rely on interrogation professionals. I know in the Hollywood version of the CIA, they do interrogations. That is not a core competency. They are an intelligence collection organization that recruits spies. They don't do it. That's why in the Cole investigation, their role was to observe and report what the
Well, let me ask you
interrogators
this
did.
though, Mark. Who in the United States government is really good at torturing? I mean, we had to invent this, right? We had to invent this after 9/11.
Well, and actually, the torture was effective in getting results. It got Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, the emir of the Khaldan training camp, to say there was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. President Bush used that information, Colin Powell used that information to drive a nation to war. So its intended purpose is to get propaganda information, often untrue, and that's exactly what happened with Ibn Sheikh al-Libi. Ibn Sheikh al-Libi was turned over to Libya, and he mysteriously died in their custody of Muammar Gaddafi. That's why it's not just ineffective, it's counterproductive, because you're basing national policy decisions on flawed intelligence.
I've spoken to FBI agents, some NCIS agents, who tell me that the problem with harsh interrogation, whether it's amounts to cruel treatment or to torture, the problem is that people undergoing that kind of pain will have different reactions, but a prime reaction is to simply say what they think you want them to say.
Exactly, and that's actually what Ibn Sheikh al-Libi said, and many others had said. Muhammad al-Qahtani did the same thing. They wouldn't let him use the bathroom. He'd say something, they'd let him use the bathroom. He said, I was just kidding.
The other thing, and you'll notice, and this isn't to pit agency against agency, but you all are familiar with the FBI. You hear minimal to no commentary from the FBI on the effectiveness of what the CIA was doing during these torture sessions. So they would argue that they are ineffective, and their most, I would say, productive information comes from relationship-based interrogations. So the other thing I would highlight, I won't quote, as Mr. Fallon did, what he thinks of our former vice president, but whatever level, when you get to that level, those that are briefing the vice president, and this is the politics of it, you don't think there are vested interests in the information he gets? You don't think the people who are conducting these operations and have their careers on the line and are doing things that they absolutely unequivocally think are right aren't going to shade the impact of their efforts in a positive way? He wasn't there. He doesn't know. He was.
Let me ask you this. I think I'm picking this up from all three of you, that we've had discussions about what techniques were used. We've had discussion about whether or not there was some valuable intelligence that came out of this, and Mark is telling us no, there really was not, and that the technique is not valid. So we've seen the practical side of this. I have a sense from all three of you that that was not the primary motivator in your responding the way you did. I'm hearing an ethical concern that is coming from Mark. I heard an ethical concern coming from Dave Brandt, and I certainly heard an ethical concern coming from you. Not just a legal, it's my turn to respond, but that I'm hearing something that offends my sense of ethics, justice, and I'm going to respond in a way. Maybe I'm too dramatic, but I just want to give each of you an opportunity to respond to the ethical question here. There's a leadership and ethical question, and each of you, just my listening to you here today tells me you took that on. Why?
The clarifying moment for me, my reaction was instinctive from the first moment, but as I sat at the Pentagon thinking through this thing, I was thinking, well, would I apply torture to save 100,000 people? And I'd sit there and say, well, maybe I would do that.
This is the classic ethical dilemma of if the only way I can stop 100,000 people from dying is if I torture them. Would I torture them?
Ticking time bomb, which is a highly artificial construct to look at this, but this is nonetheless my thought process. But then as I would sit there, I would think, well, what about 10,000 people? And I came to the realization I would do the 10th, and then 1,000 people and 100, and the answer yes, and 1. So I could find no threshold at which I could say that I would not use torture to save an innocent person, which is the moment that I realized that if we were to normalize the use of torture, just generally in our society, we'd be a different country altogether. We'd be authorizing torture to the police sergeant down the street at the local police station to use it in the fight against crime, And it would alter and destroy our ethical foundation as a nation. And it was the realization that there is no kind of threshold, using this kind of logic,
Sure.
to object against the use of torture, which helped me understand the profoundly destructive
But in this case, you
effects
weren't,
of this decision.
in this case, you weren't advising another client. You were the guy who had to, you had to take action one way or the other.
Exactly.
And so the ethical issue was for you at this point, wasn't it?
It was an ethical, but it was ethical and legal because I was so violently convinced that the legal analysis was incompetent. In fact, which is what I wrote a memoranda to individuals. The legal analysis was purely incompetent. There's no individual without rights. There were layers of legal prohibitions against the application of torture. All of these had been overridden or redefined in violation of the law
But
itself.
you eventually created documents that told the truth about this,
Yes.
that described the law accurately, and what price did you pay for that
I
within
didn't
the
pay a price
agency?
for that. It was strangely
I'll tell
enough,
people what price
because
you paid.
what happened was that Navy Marine Corps, NCA and I were united. The leadership of the Navy supported what we were doing. Every 4-star and 3-star I ever spoke with at the Pentagon, not only the Navy Marine Corps, but every other service, felt that the decision to use torture was an abomination. It was not only unlawful and contrary to our principles, but it was profoundly counterproductive as a policy standpoint. It would make us weaker, not stronger.
But there were people in
less
your
safe.
chain of command who got your memos who did not agree with you.
Absolutely, but by then, the administration had been late. And we didn't know this at first. I mean, I didn't know that the White House was involved. I didn't know that the Department of Justice was involved until John Yoo came in after Secretary Rumsfeld had rescinded his authorizations in Guantanamo on the day that I had threatened to write a memorandum describing them as torture. Then they rolled in, and after Abu Ghraib, a year and a half later, it became evident to me, what had not been evident before, was that this was not only something limited to the military, it was
a policy.
A policy reached by and adopted by the highest levels of governments, including the President of the United States.
The President of the United States authorizing what you believe today was torture.
Correct. But what happened was that the accountability piece then also became important. NCIS sold this policy because they said it was effective. Well, as Mark was saying, and as David was saying, evidence of ineffectiveness was something they could not admit because it would also undermine the legal rationale for adopting it. But also, as an agency, you want to look good. You want to describe this, and also you wanted to create the necessity argument for these kinds of techniques. Now, the Senate Intelligence Committee report found that, without exception, the use of torture on these individuals produced no significant intelligence gain.
It certainly did. That's
Did
right.
not protect any individual. And the Intelligence Science Board, which is the principal scientific body advising the Senate, did a 2-year study on interrogation and found out that the enhanced interrogation program had zero scientific basis to it at all. That in fact it was counterproductive as an effective way to elicit information.
We're going to wrap up this phase here. I just want to give Dave Brandt one last moment to comment on that question, which is the ethical leadership issue, because you led the agency involved, NCIS. You could have stayed silent. You could have given that response. Did you see the ethical moment?
Yeah, well, and it was very narrow and very clear. Organizationally, our mission there was very clear. Interrogations for criminal evidence. Those being interrogated were in captivity. They were controlled. They had been there in some cases for weeks and months. They were not an immediate threat. They probably held minimal to no information that was going to be of immediate value. It was for criminal prosecution. So just practically our role there was a role that we had clearly defined, and I intended for our people to carry out that role. On that front, what I heard was absolutely counter. On a personal front, on a personal ethical right-wrong, was wrong. I mean, how it was
And
framed.
you knew it, right?
I knew it.
You knew it and you acted on it.
Knew it.
It's amazing.
And I saw, prior to Alberto getting into the longer-term legal reviews and finding out what he found out, interestingly enough, I remember that the moment I told him, he had exactly the same reaction. This goes against our values. as
Everything that you
Yeah, I
believe.
mean, your instant reaction was that, and then if you strip it back and go, well, maybe there's something else, or maybe there's something I'm missing, or maybe there's more substance to this that puts it in a different category. Quite frankly, for me, there wasn't.
It didn't. Well, let's thank everyone for this round of our discussions. Thank the three guys. and turn this
Thank you.
over to Jonathan Anderson.
Let me tell you a little bit about how this is gonna go now. We really want to get as many of your questions and comments in here. So Dr. McQueenie is going to be looking at the questions and posing them. We had this time, we had a break scheduled in. I guess I'd like to encourage you, if you need to take a break, go take it. We'll keep doing our questions here so we can get to as many as we can before we get to our faculty panel and then back to our guests and then be able to end on time. And afterwards, just letting you know, we are going to have a little bit of a reception out in the lobby there, so you will be able to ask some questions in person to the gentleman at that point. So that's when it's going to happen. I'll turn this over to Tom then.
Hello. There we go. Thank you. I don't have a lot of questions, so I'm going to encourage you to raise your hand and do some talking if anything comes up. I have a couple that I will read, but why don't you go ahead? You have something to say right now? Did you have a question? Go ahead. A few?
That's exactly my point.
A few? Well, let's do a few. Let's take your best one, okay? Take a shot at your best one. Go ahead.
Who has been persecuted by these actions, and who do you think that it was the main person that should be charged for this?
Well, that's I think a very good question in terms of accountability for these actions. And let me ask Alberto Mora. I have my own views on accountability here. One of the things we've talked about as the two lawyers here is lawyers played an important role here in various agencies to write memoranda describing what the standard for torture was. They were wrong. To insulate those who were engaging in these acts by giving them a piece of paper saying, this act you're going to do is not a crime. That's my view.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, we're in the worst of all possible worlds now, in a sense, because we've distorted the definitions of torture, and we have held no one accountable for the crime of torture. There's no dispute that the crime of torture has been committed multiple times. It really is no longer the subject of any really serious discussion. So what's the accountability issue? Now, law, both U.S. law and international law, requires that in cases of torture there be investigations, prosecutions, and punishment. Investigations have been partial, not really completed. There have been no prosecutions, no real prosecutions, and of course there's been no punishment or restitution to those who've been damaged. While it's unthinkable from a legal standpoint that there not be accountability, full accountability for this crime, I think as a political matter, it's really unthinkable that there will be a prosecution of the president, the vice president, the attorney general, and others in the administration who did so. So how do we get out of this situation? I think it's untenable if we hope to continue to be the leaders in human rights, which is so profoundly in our vital national interest. We want to create a world that's less cruel, not more cruel. And if we normalize cruelty, we take away the accountability component, we contribute to making it a world more cruel, less protective of individual human dignity. Our national interest isn't synonymous with the interest of the individuals who authorized or executed the torture policy. But I think to recognize the reality of the political obstacles that lie in the way of accountability, I think the solution is probably twofold. One is to prosecute those who exceeded the overly broad guidelines provided by the Attorney General and the Department of Justice, and a number of those individuals are known. We know who those individuals are. But second of all, on the issue of accountability, rather than prosecute, say, the former Attorney General, I think, as we did with the Japanese American internees, taking national responsibility for having committed the crime of torture, owning up to it, making restitution to those injured would be largely satisfactory of the obligation to hold ourselves accountable for this, and would help us advance the national interest of preserving the rule of law and then regaining leadership and credibility on the international human rights front.
Great.
John, I'm throwing one your way. The questions are starting to come in now. General question has a lot of facets, but I summarize it by saying what caused the perceived incompetence we're hearing about, both the potential legal incompetence, but more specifically the incompetence with the screening that Mark mentioned earlier. Sounds like there may have been a problem with linguistics, or was it a bad organization, or was it bad management? Can you link any of the incompetence to issues that we study about here in terms of management, or is it something else?
Well, did you want, Mark,
Yeah,
why don't you answer that from the agent standpoint?
Yeah, sure, I can talk about that. I mean, the problem we had is we were unprepared for this type of war. And so during Gulf War I, we had Army interrogators, predominantly the Army, whose job it was to go and do battlefield interrogation and screening interviews. Well, what we found during Gulf War I was their techniques, the Army field manual techniques, were not effective. They use techniques that are not grounded by science, and research has determined that most of the techniques are not very effective in eliciting accurate and reliable information. We come to 9/11, we again call upon reservists. So what happens is and, you know, God bless the Reserve Corps, but if their training was predominantly an interrogation course at Fort Huachuca, which is where the Army does this training, and they're trained in an Army field manual which utilizes techniques, and they call them approaches, that are proven to be ineffective, you're asking for problems. So while I was fortunate with my task force that we had agents who had been investigators for years, who investigated rapists, murderers, robbers, other terrorists before, the other interrogators basically had only role played. When you asked if they interrogated anyone, it was just one of their other students. So the first time they were ever in the booth with a real life terrorist was after 9/11. So they were operating at a disadvantage. So in the new NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, there's actually provision in there to actually review this Army field manual, because now we have research that determines that those techniques are ineffective. So hopefully we will move forward as a nation and design better techniques. But that was a challenge we had.
Let me answer the legal part of that. I don't think the legal work was incompetent. And maybe my friend Alberto would disagree with me. I don't think it was incompetent. I think they did exactly what they wanted to do. They had memoranda drafted that said waterboarding, for example, is not torture because it doesn't cause imminent organ failure or death. So it doesn't reach that standard, but the President of the United States, Barack Obama, declared it to be torture. The Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, declared it to be torture. We know it's torture. But they created a legal document that gave everyone cover who used activities that did not amount to those things. And that meant, as a criminal prosecutor, which is my job as the United States Attorney, if I've got a potential defendant holding a piece of paper that says, my lawyer, who's also in your government, has written me an opinion saying that these activities that you're about to prosecute me for do not constitute a crime. It's almost impossible to obtain a conviction under those circumstances. So they knowingly went to the lawyers and said, give us opinions that are going to authorize us to engage in these activities, and the lawyers did it. So the question is, what sort of accountability should we have for the lawyers? But in terms of competency, even though most lawyers looking at the torture memos agree that they are wrong from a legal standpoint, they are incorrect, and they are based on falsities, they serve as a protector for the people who are engaging in the acts of torture. So I would suggest that maybe it's not so much incompetence, but competence. They did it right if their objective was to allow people to torture other human beings.
I agree with that. I mean, with the last emphasis, the last caveat, the emphasis was on providing legal cover for an illegal activity that the client proposed to undertake.
Yes.
That's exactly what this member, and also providing an accountability shield to ensure that 10 years down the road or 15 years down the road, when another administration has a different idea, well, maybe this is torture after all, that there be obstacles towards the prosecution of those individuals. However, let me say this, because I just wrote a brief for the Fourth Circuit on this point. Part of the analytical failures that our courts are now experiencing, and the general public also as a matter, is we focus too much on these interrogation techniques in isolation and in the abstract, when in reality the only way you can determine whether or not an individual was tortured was look at the totality of the abuse suffered by the individual and the impact on that kind of person, both physiological and psychological. A technique in the abstract is very different from the way it's applied, which is very different also from how all these combinations all these techniques in combination have an effect on the individual, and also the conditions of confinement are also enormously important in determining whether or not. So for the Justice Department to say waterboarding is legal doesn't answer the question necessarily whether a combination of techniques and treatments, given conditions of confinement that are harsh to begin with, whether that totality constitutes torture or not. I think when we look at the totality of the circumstances analysis, then the fact that individual techniques may have been approved should carry less legal weight to a court who wants to address the issue.
Let me try one. We have getting a lot of questions now. We got about 5 minutes left. So I might even, these are complex questions. Short answer would be preferred because we got 2 or 3 of them. I've got a really long one right here. I'm going to ask this fellow to read himself because I can't read it. Why? Why? The competence, the issues, the policies, they've been signed off, they've been approved. What's going on? Why did these people do this? Why did they do things that seem to be so un-American? Do we think there's any deep ideological? The question is radical hatred going on here? Do we hate these people enough to do this to them?
You just saw on the tape at the start, I don't know Mr. Rodriguez, but I'm sure he graphically and aggressively and forcefully put forth his point of view. There's an absolute huge quotient of revenge as a person, as a country, as almost a helpless feeling. You know, you can all probably experience or had pieces of after 9/11, in our case at NCIS, after Cole, there's a certain level of helplessness. What do you do? No matter what your job is, and we had a role as an agency. My gosh, if they're willing to do that, as Mr. Rodriguez said, or they're willing to pull up a skiff laden with explosives next to a Navy ship and commit suicide, kill sailors, what can we do? So you saw in that tape, it's revenge. We got to go do it. We got to do whatever it takes. And I would see it and hear it and feel it, and I'm sure everybody here and you all did as well.
Dave, this question is asking more, do we see any racial animosity, any anti-Muslim, do we see any of that kind of religious hatred at all motivating these people?
I just saw hatred. I saw hatred and revenge, and while you don't want to give the lawyers a pass for helping, enabling, they gave legal cover for torture, but the psychologists gave medical cover for torture.
Fair point.
Yeah.
So
But
there
the
were
individual motivation they're looking at, is there hatred going here towards a class? They
Well,
want to get the racial thing.
I mean, Rodriguez had no Al-Qaeda experience, no terrorism experience, no interrogation experience. So I think they relied on people who didn't know what to do, and they just went with what their gut was, that we're going to get back at these people.
Two more.
And
Somebody
they
says,
didn't look at the second and third order effects. So now you have Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is down at Guantanamo, and we're trying to bring a capital case against him, and we're struggling before military commissions because of the abuse that we inflicted upon him. So it's actually challenging our ability to actually bring terrorists to justice.
But I think there's, I was in Seattle at the time that 9/11 occurred as the chief law enforcement officer. And I was given instructions to facilitate the FBI going out to Muslim homes in Western Washington and knocking on doors. And when I objected to that, I was told, what we're trying to do is rattle cages. So who are you trying to rattle cages with? Well, you're trying to rattle cages against, with Muslim Americans because they're Muslim Americans or Muslims legally resident in the United States. This order came down, by the way, during Ramadan. There was massive cultural indifference to Muslim communities in the United States, just as an example of a lack of cultural awareness. So were they targeting them or were they ignorant? I don't know. I don't think it matters because I think we clearly had an impact that was based culturally, probably racially, based on lack of understanding of religion to think that Muslims as a whole would be our enemy, because that's completely false. And I think that part of the revenge that involved here allowed us to go to some of our baser instincts, and we did go out after people because of their cultural, religious, and racial differences.
this one is probably challenging something Alberto said. Despite all the declarations of our traditions of being anti-cruelty, we're the people who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. Do you see any parallels? That was cruel.
You know, that's a difficult question. You look at the area bombing, not only Hiroshima, but really World War II, Dresden, many other places. The civilian loss of life was, you know, I'm conflicted. Navy flew me out to Okinawa. And as we were approaching Okinawa in a helicopter, the Navy escort would be pointing out the cliffs where Japanese civilians would walk off the cliff with their children and their wives committing suicide rather than be subject to the American occupation. The American estimate that we could suffer 1 million casualties through the invasion of Japan, I think, is a historical fact and actual probability. So the use of an atomic weapon to eliminate that kind of problem, we wouldn't do it today, but it's difficult to condemn the leaders back in 1945 for taking that decision.
Let me take that to what I believe that many of those people were thinking. They were believing they were patriots, they love America, these people hate America, and therefore anything is justified to stop them from injuring, killing Americans, which is the same rationale for Hiroshima. These people will kill Americans. Anything is justified to stop them from killing Americans, the definition of true patriotism. How would you answer that?
I think one of the failures and strategic failures is misunderstanding what is the national strategic interest in the defense of the country. Okay, so presidents generally make decisions by identifying the national interest in a particular issue. I think what it boils down to is that we have two paramount strategic interests, and both are equally important. One is protecting our people and our homeland, which is what we acted on. We sought to protect the country, avoid further loss of life. But I think the second strategic objective is protecting our values. I think if we lose sight of the protection of values, interest, then we are capable of making the mistakes we made here before. At the end of the day, as John McCain has said, it's not about them, it's about us. And the decision to use torture has more of an impact on us as a nation than it did on the individuals that we applied the torture to.
There's another, and I don't think you heard it much here tonight. You wouldn't hear it much from any of those who would support what happened. You kind of pass it over on sort of the clinical front. It's ineffective. So you go back to the baseline. There's been no data, no body of evidence for getting the legal or the ethical or the moral that says it was of value. So no matter what you think, you're going to keep going down the same path if it gets you nowhere. And literally think back on anyone in this room, if you can cite a specific where someone is highlighting torture as a critical, necessary tool, and they tie that to a result, I would be interested in hearing what it was.
Let me just add something there, because I know people who tortured, and there is an impact on them. I've looked into their eyes. I know the pain they feel for what they've done. So there is a toll to take on the people we ask to torture as well.
And we haven't talked about the collateral costs and consequences of our use of torture. I mean, for example, an Army two-star, and this is now evidence in the WikiLeaks cables back in 2005, told me that the Joint Staff in 2005 had determined that the number 1 and number 2 identifiable causes of U.S. combat deaths in Iraq were number 1, Abu Ghraib, number 2, Guantanamo. And the WikiLeaks cable demonstrate in meetings, senior level meetings, that the single most important factor drawing foreign fighters into combat against American forces in the Iraqi theater of operations was U.S. mistreatment of detainees.
And there's a question on that, but I'd like hello? This fellow took a long time writing his question, and I can't read it. I wonder if you can give a quick summary of what your question was.
which has been subsequently rethought since I wrote it. My question is about outsourcing torture. The extraordinary rendition program that was underway at the same time, and also the use of defense contractors. A lot of what was reported in Europe was abducting people in Italy, Sweden, and other countries and shifting them back to Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, and countries where the gloves came off and acid, rape, and electrocution were not uncommon uses of torture in those countries. Today, those governments have all fallen, and options seem to have been affected by the decisions that were made 10 years ago or more in terms of what America would do with those governments and regimes that seem to be affecting the facts on the ground today. There are claims that America contributed to the formation of ISIS by some of the treatment that occurred or some of the recruiting that occurred in 2003, subsequently leading to some of today's outcomes. So to what extent do you think that the decisions were made then paved the way for the mess that we're seeing now?
This is part of the foreign policy impact that these decisions have had. 54 countries or so collaborated one way or another with the American rendition, detention, interrogation kind of program, and the political backlash in all those countries was severe. Every leader who participated in this or sought to ally themselves with the United States, once the word got out about our application of the torture program, paid a political cost. And in fact, what you see is that affected our military alliance that we had sought to build and maintain to fight the war on terror effectively. The Australian Navy refused to train the American Navy on detention operations after a point. The Canadians would refuse to turn over prisoners to the United States. The Brits would release prisoners back into combat rather than turn them over to Americans because they would not be accused of aiding and abetting criminal activity. I was personally approached by the senior military lawyers in uniform of UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand at an international conference in 2005. And what these four generals told me was, what you as a senior American here need to know is that our country's cooperation with yours across a range of military intelligence and law enforcement activities in the war on terror will continue to decrease if you persist on abusing detainees the way you are. And that story isn't told yet. I mean, those layers of impact which continue to reverberate because we have lost credibility on the international human rights front. Every time we meet with the Russians or the Chinese to talk about human rights, what they say is, wait a second, what, you're going to lecture us about human rights? No, we're not hearing it. You can, in many countries and many areas of the world, we're continuing to pay this price as a result of those decisions.
So at this point, I'm going to invite our 3CSUB faculty to come and join at the table here while I ask one final question that was given to us, and that is there any policy or law that that we should implement to make sure something like this doesn't happen? What can we do? We know it does happen. What can we do to make it so it doesn't happen in the future?
Yeah, I could address that a little bit. The McCain-Feinstein Amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act actually will codify in law, if passed, that we won't torture. Right now, it is only an executive order from President Obama that says we will not torture. Senator McCain in the Detainee Treatment Act had made it so that everyone, with the exception of the CIA, cannot torture. It was too politically hot at the time to include those. So right now, from a legislative perspective, it is only an executive order by President Obama that stands in the way of us torturing in the future, of another president in the future saying, you know what, that Jose Rodriguez was right, we're going to give this a shot again, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary. A majority of the American public believes that torture was effective. Some of you in here might believe that it was effective. So right now, and I've certainly, Alberto and I have pushed for this. We've gone up to the Hill. We met with senators. We're hoping that a law will be codified on the books that actually makes torture. It was already illegal, but really, really illegal this time. So there's no loopholes. Well, is that accurate, Alberto?
Thank you very much for that piece. Now, what we wanted to do was to try to bring some different perspectives to this whole issue, from the people who are very close to it to some of our professors who've had looked at these issues from a different perspective. And as I said, we have Dr. Susan Finson from philosophy, Dr. Tony Field from political science, and Dr. Monty Van Wart from public administration, all who come to this issue with different backgrounds. And I'm going to ask Dr. Finson from the Department of Philosophy to get some of her reactions and experiences as they relate to this. Susan?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Well, I was very interested in Mr. Mora's comments about how we either lose or maintain our values. And it seems to me that one thing that we ought to highlight tonight is something that George Orwell pointed out a long time ago, which is that when our language is unclear, when we don't actually use the correct language to describe what we're doing, this is a great facilitator of losing our way morally. And so it has seemed to me, in trying to understand as an outsider what happened here, is that those involved did not start out by saying, let's torture people, but in fact imagined that they could redescribe the situation in such a way that it was merely enhanced interrogation. And so the psychologists, who I'm quite interested in their role in all of this, Mitchell and Jessen, who were brought in as part of the cover as a way of saying, we're not really torturing. We have these medical professionals here, and they're going to tell us where that line is, right? They're going to tell us, you know, that in fact what we're doing here is really, it's really not torture. It's enhanced. It's enhanced. Sounds positive, right? It's double speak, right? It's double speak. And I think we have to recognize, as Voltaire pointed out to us long ago, that those who convince you to believe absurdities will lead you to commit atrocities. And so I think that at the heart of losing our values is the first violence is violence to language itself, when we are willing to convince ourselves of these things. And as I've been listening tonight, I realized that over time, of course, it's become very clear to everyone that yes, torture was occurring. Horrible, immoral things were occurring. And that's actually the positive outcome, is that clarity has occurred. And that clarity, since this is all very depressing, I do have to mention that very recently, finally, the American Psychological Association has voted to censure any psychologist who would, in the future, engage in this sort of activity. They are no longer, as they were before, and for a very long time before, colluding in this sort of activity and lowering their own standards. So we've had, the good news is the clarity, it seems to me, the moral clarity of those able now to say, this was all a cover. The psychologists engaged in deceptive language as well as the violence that they engaged in their inept activities. So it seems to me that it's very important to be clear about that. The other thing I wanted to bring up with regard to the role of the psychologists, and it seems to me that it is certainly pertinent to say that these individuals had no experience with effective, interviewing and interrogation. But there has been a long history of CIA, as I understand it, CIA and psychological collaboration, which ought to be further examined, which ought to be interrogated for its moral questionableness. There's been a long-standing collusion in trying to develop techniques which we ought to really call torture. If you can look back to the 1950s, Donald Hebb, for example, and Beecher and Stanley Milgram, a name I'm sure you're all familiar with, were actually doing experiments with extensive financial support from the CIA and from the Department of Defense. And it seems to me that their ongoing involvement has not had a salutary effect in all of this. So when the two psychologists who are mainly implicated in actually participating in the torture techniques, you're probably many familiar with their names, Mitchell and Jessen. This was not entirely news from nowhere, is what I would want to suggest, that their being brought in wasn't a surprising new thing to happen. And that's something that I think the APA itself needs to look at further. I applaud those who now say, great, we're no longer going to support this kind of activity, but they need to really come clean about this long-standing policy and the extensive financial support of the military to the psychological community, I think needs to be highlighted there. Mitchell and Jessen made off with, I think, $80 million?
81.
$81 million.
It was a $183 million contract. But
Right,
they cut
but
it
they
off
only
at
got as
81.
far
Yeah.
as the 80 million. Shucks, they left all that money on the table. That's our tax dollars, if I'm not mistaken. So it seems to me that, I mean, they were brought in not as experts, they were brought in as foils to provide a kind of legal cover for what was being done, right? To be the people who say, you know, we're not really torturing. And I think that's where one of the ways that we lose our way morally.
Thank you,
Almost done.
thank you, Dr. Finson. I appreciate that. I'm going to turn to Dr. Field, who is from the Political Science Department from the National Security Studies degree, and who has thought and worked a lot on this as well. And what are your perspectives on this from a different perspective, Tony?
Okay, great. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to our distinguished guests for being here this evening, and also I think it's important to recognize, you know, the courage that must have taken to make a stand for what you believed was right. So I think it's worth recognizing that, absolutely worth recognizing that. I teach a class here at CSUSB on ethics and intelligence, and we actually have a week that is devoted to the ethics of interrogation and torture. And for the sake of argument, I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit and maybe just try and pose a few difficult questions, maybe so we can understand how you managed to resolve some of the ethical dilemmas that you were faced with, and how you managed to deal with some of the arguments that I imagine you probably heard at the time about why these programs were maybe justified. So I think something that many of you mentioned, and is probably worth emphasizing a little bit, is that the threat really was unknown after 9/11, and there was a real fear of further terrorist attacks. And with hindsight, we can look back now. We can say, okay, there wasn't another 9/11. There weren't follow-up terrorist attacks within the U.S. homeland. But at the time, and for decision makers and policy makers and law enforcement, the military, the intelligence community, there was really a fear of those attacks. And I just wonder how much ideas of kind of duty and responsibility in terms of trying to protect innocent civilians, how much that might have fed into people's justification for taking some of those actions. And I'm interested to learn from you, you know, if you heard some arguments from some of your colleagues on those kind of terms. It seems to me that what is it now, 14 years later, sadly, we've become much more comfortable living with the threat of terrorism. And, you know, there's many terrorist groups out there that want to do harm to the US and to other countries across the world. And we have become, to some extent, comfortable with living with that terrorist threat. But I think the day after the 9/11 attacks, America certainly wasn't in that position. I mean, this really was a shock to the system. So how does the policy community, how do intelligence decision makers deal with a situation where they are trying to prevent an unknown threat from occurring, and there really isn't good intelligence on the organization that perpetrated the attacks? I think one of the panelists made the comment that the United States was unprepared for this type of war. And I think if we look at international parallels, we can see in the British in Northern Ireland, the French in Algeria, Israel and the Palestinian territories. What we often see is countries, bureaucracies which are unprepared for a threat, dealing in a situation of kind of crisis, responding in a situation of crisis, and kind of developing methods and policies kind of on the fly in a very quick way. I think some of you mentioned that there were not enough skilled interrogators. Nobody had sat and thought about what do we do with a global terrorist, what do we do with a global terrorist organization? Where do we detain these people? What kind of methods are acceptable? The thinking occurred after the attack and in light of the attack. So I think what's really important, and I think one of the key important things from this discussion here is highlighting the need to try and think about difficult ethical issues like torture and like interrogation ahead of the time, rather than kind of in the heat of the moment. There's a famous example from Germany in 2002 of a 11-year-old boy who was kidnapped, and the German police managed to track down and detain the kidnapper, and they spent several days trying to get the location of the child from the suspect, and he wasn't cooperative. And one of the German police officers took it upon himself to threaten that individual with torture, and basically developed a scenario where German military officers were going to come in and torture this individual. And as a consequence of that, the individual gave up the location of the child, but unfortunately it was too late, and the child was dead when the police officers managed to find him. One of the things we talk about in kind of in my class, and I think some of you made this point as well, when we have a kind of natural human aversion to torture, because it's something which most of us believe is not a part of our society, and it's something that we don't endorse. But are there situations where you as an individual, if you were put in the right situation, if you were put under enough pressure, would you go against your better instincts and potentially do something, however unethical, however regrettable, because you wanted to protect somebody else's life? I have no doubts that many of the people who engage in these activities were probably doing it to protect people and probably thought it was their duty. And it's a real shame that there wasn't the prior policy guidance and institutions in place to make sure that those people didn't overstep the mark. So I'm going to probably draw my comments to a conclusion there, but I'd be really interested to know and to hear about any of the discussions that you had with your colleagues about some of these kind of thorny ethical issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. And we're going to get responses from the panelists, from their guests, after finally we're going to hear from Dr. Monty Van Wart in the Department of Public Administration, who teaches leadership and administrative law, among other things. So, Dr. Van Wart.
First off, I want to say, again, thank you to our panel. What an extraordinary story from the people who were there and actually did it. I feel like this is Friday night at the movies. I mean, I just was rapt. When we start to take a break and the story wasn't over, I was going, no, we have to finish this story. so captivating. So I'm going to come at this, my final comment. I'll make sort of a personal comment and see if you gentlemen would like to reflect on it or simply pass on it. And mine is really about the history of ethics. So when I look at the United States, and I like to think that we are exceptional, but we're also very human, and I look at the US history, and I look at some of our worst moments, and some of them, and I'm sure that we could add more, the Sedition Act almost unhinged our political system. Treatment of Native Americans. Slavery. The Mexican-American War, which is really a land grab. Japanese Americans and their internment in World War II. And in World War II, moving to the mass bombing of civilians. There are others, but I think those are some of the biggies. I thought before tonight that this was bad, but what amazes me is how such a small, this is really, in terms of the number of people, small, despicable act can get into that level, to me, of national tragedy, as Mr. Mora explained, in terms of changing U.S. credibility around the world, destroying relationships, radicalizing the Arab world, changing U.S. history. So I'll leave that as a statement, and then if later on you want to make a comment about it, that's fine, but I'm just really honored to be in your presence. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that I hope you tried to collect some of the thoughts that have come from the faculty members here. Why don't we go to you to try to answer some of the thoughts and questions, and if there's any back and forth dialogue that you want to ask, that's fine too, but at least 15 minutes working on this.
Let me just try to corral some of these and pass some of them out. First, let me ask Dave Brandt. I mean, you heard one of the comments from our distinguished faculty panel here talking about the need for preparation. You led an agency whose one of their principal responsibilities was force protection of the naval fleet, for example. Your need to develop intelligence and to build infrastructure to prevent attacks. Can you comment on, have we learned anything from 9/11? Are we driven to acts such as torture or harsh interrogation, or are there other steps that we can take to protect ourselves?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm collecting my thoughts here. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a lawyer, I'm going to have to put all this together.
You're not a lot of things.
I'm not a lot of things. I'm not your boss anymore. Interesting, and Dr. Anderson commented before about why people do what they did, why they did what they did at the time, and then Dr., your last comment. So I'm going to go back to Cole for just a second, because that was more personal and unique to NCIS. We were part of the entire community on 9/11, but I think I mentioned before, on that morning, whenever we determined it was not an accident, and the unthinkable at that time had happened, and again, just to frame it a little bit, skiff, 2 people laden with explosives, pulls up next to U.S. naval vessel, USS Cole, and the 2 people blow it up, kill themselves and 17 sailors. So back to the term I used before, as a head of an agency, and all those who worked with me, there's a feeling of helplessness right then, right there. What do we do? Correct. We now have a responsibility to react, number one. What do we do? 17 people killed. Now, depending on where you are and what your role is and what you're tasked to do, the overreaction is you do what it takes. You do what it takes, which leads to, in hindsight, the potential for some of the discussions we are having right now. You are sitting there responsible for reacting to an event that's unprecedented, and you're tasked with reacting, resolving, and ensuring they don't happen again. How do you do that? Whether you're the head of an agency, whether you're one of those with a piece of the mission requirement to carry out certain tasks, there are no easy answers to that. There are no steps that are in place that can give you sort of the pieces of the puzzle to solve the immediate problem and prevent the next one. So the types of things that occurred, the types of reactions we saw from different people, leading all the way up to and including the discussion tonight, in hindsight with me, that's not surprising. I mean, there were reactions within our organization around, we got to do more, this doesn't make any sense, why don't we do A, B, and C? We weren't warfighters, we weren't out on the battlefield in an attack mode. So my point there is, I think, now I'm going to try to tie this together, jumping up real quickly to the torture discussion. The clearest part for me was in talking to our agents, NCIS agents, me one-on-one with them when they came back from a deployment to Guantanamo Bay, and they had in fact been sitting face-to-face with an accused or a real terrorist for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours at a time. And you'd be interested, and I was interested, I wasn't there in one of them, I would ask them questions that, well, what was it like? What are these people like? What did you say to them? And the people from my organization, this is hard to kind of put into context, literally in most cases developed some sort of relationship with them. Now these are people who were accused of, in some cases carried out, literally killed or intended to kill U.S. citizens and or allies. And yet, they had moved past the sort of react and take the immediate steps that maybe instinctively someone says will work to, I think I'm having an impact. I think because I have some sense of reaching this person, I'm gleaning information and I'm gleaning value, not only for prosecutive purposes, but for intel purposes that make a difference. So that to me was, in that very small piece of the pie, with all that was going on, going back to that helplessness, you react, you do what you can, you move forward, you put certain programs in place where you try to prevent, whether it's source networks, better relationships in the community, better understanding of the threat, and then moving all the way to the face-to-face, almost hand-to-hand combat in the environment we were in. And this kind of combat was literally face-to-face with a terrorist or suspected terrorist and developing a relationship. Now, you take what you want to from that. I'm not sure what it means. But for me, to some of the comments that you made, in the question you posed, no place for torture there.
Yeah,
None.
let me add to that as well, because a few things came from your questions. One is, while who the DoD turned to, the Department of Defense turned to, didn't know what to do, there were people who did know what to do. I had total clarity in what my job was and how to carry it out. I had experience in that regard, so it wasn't a question to me of how to do the job. I knew how to do the job. We were concerned with our own people enacting revenge, going beyond that limit, and we considered that as leaders. So before anyone deployed, we gave them training in Nuremberg. And we basically said, you cannot follow an illegal order. We anticipated people were angry. We anticipated that they might go beyond the bounds that we wanted them to. So before anyone actually did interrogation, we had legal training, we had cultural training. I spoke to every one of those people individually and said, you cannot follow an illegal order even if it comes from me. You may not follow it. You have a duty to challenge that, because if I'm off track, you better tell me, because we're on new ground here. And so we anticipated some of that. The shame about your argument about the terrorist attack or getting information, the decisions that were made denied those best prepared to do those interrogations from doing them. So for instance, by turning to the CIA and the RDI program to do the preliminary interrogations, rather than the FBI, who by far had the overwhelming experience, certainly more so than NCIS did. They had worked the East Africa Embassy bombing cases. They had worked the Turstop case on Sheikh Rahman, the World Trade Center 1. They had worked the Cole. They had a seasoned squad of investigators who had done, because the Bin Laden squad was in the Southern District of New York, where all the terrorist prosecutions for Al-Qaeda occurred. So we had a core group of subject matter experts, skilled interrogators and investigators for Al-Qaeda that we did not turn to. We turned instead to the CIA, the we meaning the government, to create an RDI program to do that instead of the FBI. And to me, that was a critical error, because we abandoned the people who were best prepared to obtain national security information.
I was going to turn and ask you, why don't you go ahead and make your comment? I was going to turn to you because I think there's an interesting question raised about the justification for torture in the future. We now have proposals from reputable lawyers and educators, legal scholars, who are saying that maybe the future preparation for scenarios like this are actually judges who would issue torture warrants. That you would go to a specially designated judge and say, this unusual circumstance, perhaps it's post 9/11, perhaps it's the scenario of the child, perhaps it's the 100,000, the ticking time bomb, but that you should be able to go to a judge and get a warrant to commit torture. What do you think of that, Alberto?
Well, I think it's an abomination, but I think it raises the point, John, that and I'm not sure that anybody needs a reminding of that here, but this issue is very much alive today.
It is.
This is
exactly.
We're not talking only about the 2002-2005 historical period. Almost every Republican candidate for president is an enthusiastic supporter of enhanced interrogation.
True statement. That's absolutely right.
Ben Carson feels there should be no rules at all. Never mind the rule against torture. There should be no rules whatsoever of any kind in the fight against ISIS. So the possibility that we may get a president who wants to go back to the good old days of this is a very real prospect, which is why we as citizens need to understand this now, why we as citizens, before the next terrorist attack comes, need to make up our minds as to what decision we're going to make next time this issue comes up to the decision makers. But related to this, we have been prepared for this. We've known what the American attitude has been about torture going back to George Washington. Literally, George Washington sought to distinguish the Revolutionary Army from the British by the humanity with which we treated captives. Abraham Lincoln, in the existential war in American history, outlawed torture, the only categorical prohibition in the Lieber Code, which he signed personally, and which became the foundation for Geneva treaties after the Civil War. We prosecuted American soldiers for waterboarding Filipinos in the Filipino-American Wars in 1903. So we have and we didn't torture individuals in World War II. So up until the last presidency, we had an unbroken, proud American history of understanding that we don't treat defenseless captives with cruelty. This has been the heritage and tradition.
Let me, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just a couple of, turning to the other issues. Language has been distorted. New York Times didn't start using the word torture until last year. So the press, collective failure of journalism, kept repeating the administration's positions that we don't torture, and no, it's harsh interrogations or enhanced interrogations. They failed to put the proper label on these issues. We need to be reminded that these actions alter our national character. What do you call a journalist who tells the truth 99 times but doesn't the 100th time? You call that person a liar. what do you call a country or a system that treats 99 prisoners humanely, but then tortures the 100th? Well, you call that country a torturer. Because these kinds of acts that are so violative of the character brand the person committing these kinds of departures from the norm. It's important that we understand what's at stake here on these kinds of decisions, as I mentioned, because the issue is still very much alive.
I think maybe the last point that I would take out of this panel and pose to our discussants here was the history of ethics question that we were getting, which I think poses this very beautifully, if I may say, to all of, especially the students who are here, because it's an overview and a context of torture that maybe relates to an event that will occur in the lives of some of the watchers here. Not perhaps the kind of the drama that has come from this panel, but that every person faces ethical moments in their lives, and that in their careers, the careers that are going to emerge from those in this room, they'll face some very difficult ethical questions. And the examination of a tough one like this, the torture question and some of the questions asked here, put in the context of the history of ethics in this country, I would just pose the question almost to the people in this room. What can you learn from the challenging ethical questions that face these three gentlemen in a tough time in our history and others in our government? Some who responded well, some who did not respond well. What does that mean in the lives of students and others who have come to participate in this forum? Can we learn from this? Can we take these difficult decisions made by these folks and say, there's a way to apply them in our life, there's a way to inform ourselves through education, but also to be prepared to make the hard ethical moral decision. I throw that out there to our panelists and also to our academics here. And leave it to you, Jonathan.
Let me ask because I didn't give them too much time beforehand. So let me ask our faculty panelists for any final thoughts. Tony, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to add? And let me put the microphone by you.
Yeah, I mean, kind of tying in with the comment about language. I mean, and I think this was kind of touched on by the panel at various points. I think from an intelligence perspective and from an investigative perspective, dealing with a global terrorist organization is in some ways a different kind of threat than maybe just dealing with a domestic group or a kind of normal, normal criminal issue. And I'm not quite sure that we've figured out the best way to deal with those kind of threats and a kind of consistent approach that, be it the UK or the US, that as a kind of nation we are comfortable with. I think one of the biggest problems with counterterrorism policy on both sides of the Atlantic has been inconsistency, and I think you kind of touched on that point. I think many of the kind of relationship building techniques that you mentioned have a proven track record of being successful. I guess one of the ethical dilemmas with that kind of approach is that some people would argue that taking somebody away from their family and their home country and detaining them for lengthy periods of time without charge and subjecting them to days of questioning and relationship building, essentially holding somebody in a prisoner of war camp, some people would argue that constitutes torture. So clearly it's a different type of torture than some of the physical methods we've heard about, but some people would argue that's a method of psychological torture. So is there an acceptable area between normal standard domestic police interviewing practices at one end of the spectrum and then at the other end of the spectrum kind of unrestricted torture? Is there an area that maybe is unresolved or needs more kind of consideration or more work in terms of figuring out are there actions that are appropriate in that area for dealing with the global terrorist threat that maybe we need to ask some kind of serious questions about potentially? Anyway,
and I think, Tony, that one of the issues there is not just that continuum, but what works. And I was hearing from our our guests that relationship building works, and inflicting pain gets all sorts of stuff, may get the truth, but gets everything else as well. Let me turn, though, to Susan and to say, okay, Dr. Philosopher, do the ends justify the means? Because ultimately, that's the question that's up before us in our personal lives, in the life of our country. Do the ends justify the means?
Well, you know, as a utilitarian, you would think I would say yes, but I mean, I tend to feel that it turns out that doing the right thing usually works. I mean, that's what we heard from those who actually know. That is, by not compromising our values, by not doing the hideous thing, it just turns out that you also get results, which is, you know, maybe there is a God. I mean, you know, I don't know why, but in this particular case, it seems to me that that's very clear, that what should have been done morally and what would work lined up beautifully. Now, there may indeed be cases where it just seems like, you know, gosh, we just have this terrible choice. But this is where I think a clear vision of who we are and what we stand for comes to the rescue. Or we say, no, we stand here. We stand here. And that, you know, that's the thing that I appreciate so much about this panel and the opportunity to be listening to you is that clarity. It seems to me what you all have in common is that clarity of vision in the face of such, you know, such trying circumstances.
And Dr. Van Wart, the question to you is what does it mean to be an ethical public leader? What does that meaning of that word, that adjective, ethical, in front of public leader mean?
Well, following not only the law, but following principles that in an advanced society we believe that we should follow. How you treat prisoners defines the person or the entity that you are. And the problem with torture is that it's done in secrecy. It's done where there's not transparency. And so the possibility for abuse with torture is just extraordinary. So even the one case about the child, it's like one child, I mean, I hate to say it, but one child in comparison to the slippery slope is frankly very little. We should not be about risk prevention. We should be about risk reduction as we balance our values, because we do all sorts of dangerous things we allow in our society. We're famous for guns. We love guns. If we really want a safer society, we should simply take all guns out of our society. We'd save a lot of people. But we balance these things. I just cannot, again, I'm stating more personal opinion, but the story that I've heard tonight has convinced me once again that we need to be, we need to go back to Kant, and we do have to have good principles and follow our principles, and they will get us to good ends.
Thank you, Dr. Van Wart. Now, now I just want to give a very strong thank you, first of all, to our faculty panelists here. Thank them for being a part of this. And to John McKay and Alberto Moro, Mark Fallon, Dave Brandt, who came all this way to San Bernardino, California, to share their experiences with us. Thank you so much. And a final thank you to Dr. Tom McQueenie, whose brainchild this was, and who came up with the idea of making a world-class public program that we could all benefit from. Thank you, Tom. Finally, we do have a reception, meaning we've got some cookies and water out there to munch on. And our guests will come out there and be open to your questions if you have any to them about what they've experienced. So thank you very much for being here. We really appreciate it.